Huge blockbuster deal as the Packers really get a absolute dominant defensive line, at least pass rushing wise, now as Micah Parsons is going to be their lead guy, and Rashawn Gary, who at points in his career has been a very viable number one edge rusher, is easily now edge rusher two. So hopefully he can regain his magic for the Packers, and now they have two bona fide number one edge rushers, which would just be terrifying. The compensation, two first round picks to the Cowboys, and Kenny Clark, 120 million guaranteed for Parsons, getting locked up by the Packers, of course, 47 million per year. Huge contract, biggest for a non-quarterback of all time, really up there with the quarterbacks, even as they are, so highly paid nowadays with the market realizing the importance. So this is a very gutsy move by the Packers. It thins out their already pretty lacking interior with Devontae Wyatt and Carl Brooks being basically the only known defensive tackles at the moment, and both of which being much more pass rushing oriented than they are run defending. So it is a bit worrisome in that regard. Maybe the Packers can pick up someone as we move along to help fortify that position a bit, but at the end of the day, it's Micah Parsons. And, we can argue the long-term ramifications, two first-round picks, that is a great value right there. Even if the Packers do, say, win a Super Bowl for one of those years, and it's pick 32 is still extremely valuable. So that is a big dang deal to give up, and that contract is massive. So good return for the Cowboys. I do like it though because I hate Jerry Jones. I'm a reasonable guy. Jerry Jones is a bad dude. Lots of reasons to think that. And Jones really shot himself in the foot in this situation. He waited too long to re-sign Dak. He waited too long to sign CD. Waited too long to sign Parsons. And as a result, you end up overpaying the first two and not getting to keep the third. So this really solidifies them further in purgatory. I think their over-under pre the move was 8 wins. So they were not projected to be anything to begin with. And now they lose probably their best player. Lamb, amazing. Dak did have an MVP caliber season a few years ago. So there is that. You can argue if you want that Parsons was 2, or maybe if you want to really be bold, he was 3. But either way, he was a premier edge rusher. And now they're just really further in purgatory, especially with the Kenny Clark piece of things. Maybe they flip him and get some additional value that way. But knowing the Cowboys, they do love being in purgatory. So I doubt that happens. I think the Cowboys are just going to try and say, hey, let's be kind of good for a while and then potentially kind of good later as well. Never really compete, kind of keep status quo in that sense. This is really rough for the Cowboys in that sense. If they do really pivot from what they're known for and actually decide to rebuild for once, this could be something. 2 first on top of your first, which would be good because you're not a good team as is and you can ship off the remaining assets of the team. You can start rebuilding. Right now, though, they don't have really young talent. They don't really have old talent. So they really need to lock into the rebuild, which I don't think they will. But on positive terms, this makes the Packers really, really scary. They were already a legit team. You could very well have argued that they were the best team in the NFC North and the second best team in the NFC as a whole before Parsons. Now I think they clearly take the number one spot in their division. The Lions, a great team, but the upside for this Packers team is so high. Jordan Love has about as high of a ceiling as anybody in the league. It's a bit overstated that he didn't have a great year last year because he did still have a good year. It just wasn't, amazing. So it's a little bit worrisome where, he hasn't been consistently amazing. But he's really shown flashes, and for a guy that's only been a starter for 2 years, what do you want? You want him to be just Patrick Mahomes and be perfect basically from day one? I think that's a little bit of a lofty standard that can't be matched by basically anybody. So this is really, really putting the Packers in the mix. I do want to be very clear about that. I think the Packers have about as good of an insulation as any team for injuries. Obviously, you don't want that to happen, and it still would be very detrimental if you do, because, you're just not going to have equal backups to what your starters are. But I think the Packers really have a solidified floor as well, because we have seen Love be good. He's never been bad in the league for any consistent period of time, even when he was hurt last year and, wasn't as good as he showed to be in year one starting. So that's a great, situation at quarterback. They have tons of wide receivers. There is a little bit of a worry that they don't have that true number one, but they drafted somebody that could be number one, and they already have, Jaden Reed, who I think is a number two, not a number one, but, having Love be able to elevate the situation, you can deal with that. And if you do get a great rookie season, I'm blanking on the name. Was it Golden? I believe I blended together a lot of the receivers, but I believe it was Golden that they got. It was a receiver I really liked, but I'm just kind of blanking because I haven't been super in the loop recently. I just recently moved and was having some difficulties with my mental health as well. So that's why the videos were lacking, but I am trying to get back in the swing of things. So all of that, though, says, great offensive line. Basically, everybody can play every position. It's amazing what they do there in that regard. They do now have, as I said, the edge situation figured out. You got Parsons, who I think is a bit underrated, believe it or not, because no one consistently puts him at one for best edge rusher in the league. I think the far and away guy that gets talked about most at number one is TJ Watt. TJ Watt didn't really have a good year last year, so he's definitely not number one as it stands right now. Myles Garrett, I'll totally hear out Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett is incredible, but Parsons is really on just a different level than a lot of people realize. To put it into perspective, Parsons averages a pressure, which is the best pass rushing stat available. Maybe you could argue pressures per, rush, but pressures are much more sustainable than sacks. They show your productivity without, being too reliant on great coverage, extending the time to get to the quarterback, or the quarterback holding on to it too long. Pressures happen a lot more than sacks. Pressures indicate value more. He averages a pressure on 1 out of 5.3 rushes. Now you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? Is that great? Is that terrible? I don't know. Khalil Mack, when he was traded from the Raiders, amazing player, Khalil Mack. He was averaging one pressure every 6.9 rushes. That is a huge difference. So you're like, whatever, that's Khalil Mack, just Khalil Mack. An amazing player, but that's just one guy. Myles Garrett in his career averages a pressure every 7.1 rushes. So starting to notice how incredible 1 every 5.3 is. And, Parsons isn't doing this with the absolute greatest coverage behind him that's extending things to make his job much easier. He's had some really good cornerback play in there. He did have the one good year from Diggs. He had an incredible year from Bland, but he's just not having like this Legion of Boom defense behind him that extends things. It's pretty apples to apples. And, to top it all off, you're like, why didn't you mention TJ Watt? Where is TJ Watt in this? Regarded as the best edge rusher in the league. Watt's actually far and away the worst in this department, as he averages one pressure every 7.5 pass rushes. That's, an extra 2 and a little more pass rushes to get a pressure for Watt on average than Parsons. Watt did have that down year last year, but that's not changing things too much. It was pretty bad in all actuality, even though it doesn't really get talked about. But that's not bringing it up to 7.5, from like 3. It just shows that Watt is not nearly the productive pass rusher that Parsons is. And, Watt, amazing run defender, so he does add value that way. But at the end of the day, we're paying pass rushers or, edge rushers or what have you, players to get after the quarterback. And Parsons does that at just a ridiculous level, where he is crazily outpacing the league's best. And you could argue, this is only a sign of things to come. Parsons, 26 years old, just now entering his real prime, and he only started playing edge rusher a year into his professional career. He was an off-ball linebacker at Penn State. He started as an off-ball linebacker for the Cowboys as well. This is a ridiculous baseline for Parsons, and he is just now getting to his, athletic peak where most guys do reach their top career points. So, the Packers, extremely, extremely scary. I don't want to overreact. It is a non-quarterback after all, but I was very close on the Packers and the Lions already. This does have me take the Packers now in their division, and I still like the Eagles number 1 in the NFC. I will try to get some power rankings going. Maybe just do one video, really, kind of brief on teams and state where I have the teams. But as a prelude to that, I do still have the Eagles number 1 in the NFC. But the Packers are definitely knocking on the door now to dethrone the Eagles. And that's, again, no disrespect to the Eagles. Eagles, amazing top to bottom. One of the best teams in recent memory, really. And, they did lose some pieces, so they are a little bit more human. But they had such a great baseline, you can afford to get a little bit worse and still be amazing. So the Packers, super dangerous. The Cowboys, really middling now, just super in purgatory. Already seemed like they were heading nowhere. Now they're really heading nowhere. Unless, again, they do just fully hit the reset button, which I doubt they will, because that would take Jerry Jones out of the spotlight. And at the end of the day, Jerry Jones does not care about winning. He cares about being in the spotlight. And rebuilding, you're going to take a pause on being the focus. So this is, really rough for the Cowboys if they continue on this trajectory. And really exciting for the Packers. Really exciting for the NFL as a whole. I do think the NFL becomes even better when you really do have some parity going strong. And like I said, the Packers were already in the mix for contention, but now it's like, oh man, is this good enough to beat the Eagles type of good? Is this good enough to be the best team in the league good? It's certainly arguable. And at the end of the day, that's about all you can hope for. You're not ever going to be like best at every single position and be clearly the best team in the league. You just got to put yourself in the mix, and they're really in the mix, and they do have, the threat teams never want to see in the playoffs, because if Jordan Love hits his, best performance for a 3-game playoff stretch or 4-game, whatever, that's terrifying for the league. And, Parsons, he gives you about as much of a chance on defense as anybody in the league. If he just goes berserk and gets, like Jared Verse say. Jared Verse against the Eagles, great offensive line for the Eagles. Verse was dominating that game still. And Parsons consistently is ahead of Verse even, which again, no dig on Verse. Verse is amazing. But if, Parsons reaches, his best stretch at the right time, he's going to derail offenses by himself. And then you got Rashawn Gary who can reach that level too, where, you want to double team both, but at that point you're double teaming two guys. You have 4 linemen on 2 guys. You're going to have to block a lot of people to make that work. And at that point you're sending no guys on routes, so the coverage gets easier. This is a very fun time for the Packers. It's risky because of the 2 picks. The contract is huge. But I think it's very reasonable to do. Because, again, too, Mac went for about that package, and Mac was nowhere near as efficient as a pass rusher as Parsons is. Those are my thoughts on the Micah Parsons deal. Be sure to let me know what yours are in the comment section, and also be sure to like and subscribe. I am going to be starting to pump out NFL videos again, and I will be pumping out basketball videos as well, too, in the near future. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you for watching.